Atomic gigantification was a sweeping Japan nation when along came a dude with an ultra attitude, a common rider who's the greatest kicker of Japan. And of all, man, life's too short now, baby, to not talk big now, baby.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Kaiju Conversation Live. I'm your host, Elijah, and joining me today is a very special guest, somebody who I'm sure if you have been paying attention to any podcast around, you know the name. You've seen his merchandise on Amazon. You've seen it promoted. You've seen it talked about. It's something that this fandom's been asking for a long time, and here we have it finally after so long. So with that, I must introduce Mr. Jeffrey Angles. Hello.
Hi there. How are you doing? Yeah, thanks for having me here today.
Thank you. When I finally emailed you, I was like, I don't know, like he's done so many shows, like maybe he'll be like, I'm kaiju'd out for now.
No. How such a big subject. How could you possibly get tired of it?
So before we get into any deep conversation, I think obviously your book, Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again, what an accomplishment.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm really happy that you invited me here to talk about it today. Yeah.
And this is based on the book, but more so my interest a little bit. So I've been I started studying Japanese last year.
Oh, okay, great.
I'm on 206. I think 206 days.
Oh, fantastic.
So what is it like? Because you're a translator, correct?
Yes, yeah. So I work at Western Michigan University where I teach Japanese literature and Japanese cultural history and also Japanese language. But yeah, translation is the part of my job that I think I probably like the most. It's definitely the most fun.
So I've heard conflicting opinions, and I'm sure it's different for everybody, but how long did it take you to learn Japanese?
Oh, yeah, that seems like a really easy question, but it's quite deep. Because, with any language or with any kind of field of study, you can always go farther, right? So I started learning Japanese when I was 15 years old. I was an exchange student in southwestern Japan. And I'd hardly been outside of the US at that time. So for me, it was like a really, really exciting venture. And I just decided that I was going to keep on learning after that. So I just kept on going. I studied Japanese in college, and then I went to Japan after college again, worked in Japan. So I've been doing Japanese now for 37 years. And still there are things that I don't know. Still there are things that I'm looking up and learning. But yeah, I mean, it took probably about 8-9 years before I began to read books, fairly comfortably without using a dictionary too much.
Gotcha.
Yeah, Japanese definitely takes a long time. It's a complicated language, as I think you probably know. But it's fun. It's if Japanese were easy and you could like learn it by just taking a pill and swallowing it, and everyone would speak Japanese. So it makes it special.
Yeah. So I'm not even through. Like I don't know if I'm behind or not, but I'm like barely like maybe a quarter away through N5.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know if I'm ahead or not, but
no, that's doing great.
Something.
Yeah, no, that's great for less than a year. Yeah, good for you.
Good.
Yeah, hang in there. Gammatte kudasai ne. Hang in there.
I understood some of that. I'll take that.
Great.
Actually, one of the things I was kind of really, I don't know if blessed is the right word or not. And I don't mean to make this about me as much, but I've talked about it. It's known now, so I can talk about it. I worked on the Blu-ray for Yuzo, the Biggest Battle in Tokyo.
Oh, fantastic.
And I interviewed the director, an actor, and the
Uh-huh.
suit designer for it. I of course had a
Oh,
translator. I couldn't do
uh-huh.
that myself.
Uh-huh.
Um, but there were certain questions where when my translator asked it, their response I could hear and understand fully before
All
he
right.
even translated. I was like, that's so cool. Like I couldn't believe I could do that.
Good for you. Yeah. And I'm sure that as you keep on going, you'll find that there are more and more of those moments when you're like, oh yeah, yeah, I got all that. Oh, I got all that. So yeah, the at first it feels like a long slog. Japanese is definitely one of the hardest languages for English speakers to learn. But yeah, as I think it's definitely worth it. And as I think you probably know already, Japan is a very kind of warm and welcoming culture. So if you even try to speak Japanese, very often people in Japan will be like, oh wow, that's great. Keep on going, keep on trying. So people are very open.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm sure was a huge undertaking for you on the
Mhm.
book was, and maybe not, but translating, and a lot of the things about Japanese, to my understanding, is understanding the context.
Right,
Um,
right,
one
right.
one thing that I really love, and this is like my go-to fun factoid,
Uh huh.
is in the Japanese language,
Uh huh.
it's not necessarily gender based, right? Like
Right. That's correct. Yeah, that's right.
and it's very like they themish until you understand the context.
That's right.
Um,
Yeah.
and I remember you've talked about how you, even when you wrote it, you were debating on what to refer to Godzilla as.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Um, and that was I love that. I just think that's such a cool thing because I mean, you have to question what's more accurate, what's more um true to the translation.
Right.
Um,
Right. Right.
and
Yeah.
you know, I just think that's so cool.
Great.
Especially for a character that's not really gender based, right?
Right, right, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, for people who are listening and might not know, in the book that I translated, Godzilla obviously is a huge figure, right? This is the book, the novelization for the first two movies, Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again. And so Godzilla's in it all the time, right? But in the original text, there's no mention anywhere ever about what Godzilla's gender is. And so at first, I tried to refer to Godzilla as it, to avoid the problem of gender. But then I found, like, when I showed the draft of the translation to my students, they were like, the word "it" is too kind of distancing. It's like too far away from it's not personal enough for, especially for a creature that's got like such strong personality. He's like doing things. He seems to have volition. It doesn't seem like Godzilla is just this kind of like object. And so then that, if it's not going to be it, then what pronoun am I going to be using then? And so
Mhm.
Japanese, as you said, like works really nicely without the need to use he or she. There are those pronouns in Japanese. You can use them, but very often you don't need to use them at all. You can just drop the subject whenever it's understood. So Spanish works perhaps in a little bit similar way. It's when it's clear from context. You just don't need to put the subject in. But Japanese is even more extreme. So you've got this novella, which is like more than 100 pages, and there's not a single pronoun anywhere to refer to Godzilla. So that was a real challenge. In the end, I ended up making the kind of somewhat controversial decision of going with he. I tried using they, kind of in the singular kind of current usage to like non-binary usage, because I kind of like the idea of making Godzilla sort of hermaphroditic or non-binary or perhaps even queer in some kind of way. but you know, when it actually introduced like a lot of confusion into the text when I used they, I found, because like when Godzilla was attacking people or whatever, chewing them up in his teeth or whatever, sometimes it would become unclear whether or not the they was the people who was attacking or the they was, you know, Godzilla themselves. So that was a bit of a challenge. My editor didn't like that one, so in the end we ended up going with he. I know Toho Studios' official position is that Godzilla doesn't really have a gender, but you know, I don't know. Well, maybe Toho Studios will be mad at me, but it's okay.
So that actually
Excuse
leads
me,
to.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to apologize since I'm in the sun. My computer faces the window right here, and I've got a beautiful sunset right behind you. So so if there's anybody watching and wondering like what's going on with this camera, that's the reason. So I'm trying to avoid the sun so I can yeah, be present for you.
So that actually leads to something I'd be curious about.
Yeah.
So I've heard some horror stories. I've heard some great stories with people I've interviewed, with people I've read interviews or watched interviews. Did Toho have any real involvement in the translation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in this translation, they did not. I did it completely independently of Toho, and the reason for that is the original Japanese copyright wasn't held by Toho; it was held by Kayama's descendants. So someone in Kayama's family. So we worked with them to get the copyright for this.
Really?
Yeah. So there are. I think that there are different copyrights for different like stages. You know, like the as you probably know, and I'm sure lots of kaiju fans out there know, the production of Godzilla in 1954 was a pretty complicated deal. There's like a whole bunch of different versions of it that were drafted. The very first draft of the screenplay, what's called usually in English the G Project scenario, was written largely by the same guy who wrote the novellas that are translated, Kayama Shigeru, if you put his name in the Japanese order. Shigeru Kayama, if you put it in English order. So he drafted like the very first draft of the screenplay, and then a whole bunch of people then kind of jumped in, started rearranging things, changing things that they thought wouldn't work very well on the screen. You know, the special effects director, Tsuburaya, you know, like helped to develop the special effects scenes, which I think Kayama had only sketched out in like a very kind of general form, because he figured that the special effects people were going to do whatever they wanted with it anyway. So and then later on, after the movie was out, Kayama did the novelizations that have translated. So the draft of the first screenplay, which we do have and is, you know, pretty readily available in Japan if you want to buy it, was something also that I really wanted to translate, but that was a whole separate copyright. So if I wanted to include that, which I kind of do, maybe that's another project. But that would involve a different copyright. And I can't remember off the top of my head what the complications are there, but yeah, it was somewhat complicated. This is just a little bit of an aside, but I don't know if anyone's interested, but I've become really interested in the versions of Godzilla that were released before the movie came out. And there actually were a whole bunch of different versions. There was the screenplay, which was written and nobody really saw until, you know, somewhat afterward. Then there was a radio drama that was on the radio. I forget how many installments, but, you know, for a few months before the release of the movie to kind of create publicity. And then there was a whole series of manga and versions of it, which were released in a bunch of different magazines. And so some are not exactly manga, but more like children's illustrated versions. So there were a couple of versions of Godzilla that were out before the movie ever hit the theaters. And I kind of would like to do a book collecting all these like earliest like pre-movie Godzilla versions together in one book and publish them together. But that's just a crazy idea that I've got right now. But I think the copyrights might be a little bit of a headache. And
right.
trying to get Toho Studios to sign on board, might be a little bit complicated.
Right. I mean, you never know. They have been more willing to work with companies recently.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
maybe.
yeah. I hope so. I hope so. I mean, there's a lot of interest out there in the big G. So, yeah, I, I think there's money to be made and a lot of fun to be had with him. So, I hope I can convince him to do it.
And just kind of jumping off of that, there's a lot of different versions of different kaiju movies. Specifically, I think about Varan, giant monster Varan had a whole nother they had a whole nother plan for it initially, until the U.S. company, I believe it was, that was co-producing it dropped out with them. So there's a whole nother version of Varan out there. There's the Luminous Fairies in Mothra, correct?
There is, yeah. In fact, I've got the book right here in front of me. It's sitting right here on my desk. Yeah, the Luminous Fairies in Mothra. It's funny you should mention this because as soon as the word hit the internet that this was going to my translation of the Godzilla novels was going to come out, a whole bunch of people, I don't know if people started coordinating or what, but a whole ton of people wrote to the press and said, "Oh my God, we hope that you're going to do the Luminous Fairies in Mothra next." And so the press wrote to me and said, "Hey, Jeffrey, what can you tell us about this novel version of the Luminous Fairies in Mothra?" And so I wrote back to them and told them all about it, and I went ahead and translated the whole thing. And so in the hopes that the University of Minnesota Press will publish it. And so they're now very interested, and we've just put in an offer for to the rights holder in Japan to try to make that into a book.
Will be awesome. I have a friend. His name's Danny DiManna, and he started a little nonprofit fan project, the Godzilla Novelization Project.
Oh yes, okay, interesting.
And,
yeah, I've seen that online. Yeah.
He is in love with the Luminous Fairies in Mothra. So
okay.
He, I want to say, was it Kaiju Transmissions where you talked about that book? I think.
I might have. I think I did talk with him about it a bit. Yeah, I've forgotten who I've talked to about with what. I've been talking so much kaiju these days that I forget exactly what I've said to whom. But yeah, Danny and I, it sounds like he and I should have a conversation because I think it's a really fun book. It's a very, very quirky book too. The Luminous Fairies in Mothra was written not by one, but by three authors. And and so Toho Studios, I guess, asked the writer Nakamura Shinichi to work on it. And I'm not exactly sure how the other two authors got roped into it. If Nakamura, the one author, kind of said, "Hey, I'll do it if I can do it with these other two buddies of mine," or what exactly. But anyway, they kind of passed the story from person to person. So one person wrote the beginning, one person wrote the middle, another person wrote the end. So the rights situation is a little bit complicated for Luminous Fairies and Mothra. And I'll be honest, the writing is a little bit uneven because it was with three people rather than one. It doesn't necessarily sound like the same voice the whole way through, but still, I mean, part of that quirkiness of it is what makes it fun, I think. So I hope that some of the kaiju fans out there will be as geeked about it as I am. So,
and another one, this one has a translation, and I really need to get it. It's a fantastic tale of island adventure, the undersea warship, which became Atragon.
Yes, that's right. That's right. That was written by a writer by the name of Oshikawa Shunro. And he was like an adventure kind of boys fiction, kind of colonial exploration type of author. He's perhaps a little bit like Edgar Rice Burroughs in English, writing these kind of adventure stories that were geared for young men. But that was written, I forget the exact year. It was around the year 1900, so it was a really early work. and it influenced a whole generation of like young readers, like everybody, in who's reading kind of boys fiction in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s knew about this book. I've seen it referenced so many times, and yes, there is a. I only found this out recently, but there is a translation of it. Yeah. I haven't compared it to the original to see what it looks like, but yeah, it's out there, and it's a really famous book. Yeah, which, as you said, inspired the Toho movies. Several decades after it was originally written.
Mhm. So yeah, I mean, that one, Luminous
Uh-huh.
Fairies, the
Uh-huh.
Kayama books. There's so
Yeah.
many like
Yeah.
versions that just
Yeah.
I would love to. I know there's like uh different versions of Son of Godzilla. There's some
Hmm.
scrapped ones too.
Mm.
Those would be really cool to see. Kind of the Tokyo two Godzillas, Tokyo SOS, the original version of Son of
Uh-huh.
Godzilla.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Um, and
There's a lot of work out there to be done.
there is.
Yeah. Since the Luminous Fairies and Mothra is a relatively short work. I was having a conversation with my editor at University of Minnesota Press about, like, is it long enough to be a book in and of itself? And we're still having a conversation about that. But originally, I had suggested maybe including some other things along with it. Um, there's another Toho movie that I really love that's called Matango. About oh, I can see a reaction. Yeah, you and I feel the same way about it, I think. Yeah. It's the weirdest, strangest, quirkiest story, but completely fascinating in a
Mhm.
strange way. About people who go out to a South Pacific island, and they eat some mushrooms there, and then slowly begin turning into these kind of weird fungi creatures themselves. Um, but that was based on a British novel. Was actually there was a British short story which was then rewritten in Japanese and kind of updated and localized by a Japanese writer by the name of Fukushima Masami, I think. And then that was turned into the movie. So that one also had a really kind of interesting publication history. And I had originally suggested putting Matango in the same book with the Mothra story, but I don't know if that's going to happen or not. But
That would
it's
be
a heck
really
of a good
cool.
story. Yeah, yeah. Thanks. But
Now,
you're right. Like, there's so
okay,
much to do. So much to do. All these stories out there.
there is. And there's just such in a way, I feel like almost with your book, you've opened Pandora's box, right? Like there's now so much.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many versions out there. Like, there's a novel version of Godzilla -1, which was written by Yamazaki, the director himself.
Mhm.
So I don't know if he had the help of a ghostwriter or anything like that, but it's published under his name. So there's another one that I think really really deserves translation. I'd be
Mhm.
surprised if Toho Studios wasn't working on that one themselves already. But
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, and especially with -1, this is just my inner like filmmaker just
Uh-huh.
wanting to know more information. That one, there's 40 draft. I believe it was 40 drafts before Yamazaki
Oh,
came up with the final one. I would
okay.
love to see that progression. He
Yeah,
started in
yeah.
2019 and he
Uh-huh.
wrote up until 2022, I think.
Mm, mm. Wow.
So there's 3 years of just treatments for -1, and I'd love to see
Mm.
what changes. What did he do? What went into the creative process?
Yeah. I love that process of looking at different versions of a text to try to understand, what was important to the people who are creating the story. Like, how did they shape the story? Why did they decide to include certain elements versus others? And if you look at the different drafts of the story, you get a much clearer view of what was really important to those creators.
Mhm,
And honestly, that way of thinking was kind of what led me to this novelization in the first place. The novelization of Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again that I translated were both published in 1955. So just very shortly after the second movie came out. And the reason I was attracted to them was because I wanted to know, like, when I first got involved with this this whole idea, I'd liked Godzilla since I was a kid, um, but I didn't really think about it as a literary venture. I thought of it as a purely cinematic thing for such a long time until I was showing it to my students at one point, and I just got intrigued by the second subtitle that came up that said based on the work of Kayama. And I was like, what? Based on the work of Kayama? Like, I recognized, this famous science fiction novelist's name here, but then, that made me want to investigate and find out what his involvement was. And in the English versions of like the story of Godzilla, like in the origin story of the movie, they don't talk a lot about his particular role. They talk a lot about the director, the producer, the special effects directors, and so on, the suit actor, and so on. But that part was left out. And so by turning to the novelizations, which were penned solely by Kayama, they were solely his work. I think for the first time I really got a clear view of what was important to him. The guy who, he wasn't the first person to come up with the radioactive monster idea, but he was the one to basically give Godzilla most of the form that we know today. He was the one who gave the story its major contours. And so by looking at the novelizations, I felt like I got a really clear picture of what he wanted to do with the monster story. And so, like, movies are so complicated, as you said, there's like a ton of drafts or a ton of people involved, and so the picture can get really muddy sometimes, like, who was doing what and why were they doing this? Why did they add such a scene? Why did they cut out something else? Sometimes those pictures get really muddy, but when you've got the version that's just got like one person's name on it, then you can be like, okay, all right, this is what Kayama wanted to see here. So,
and I think that's another great thing to talk about. One thing that I would love to see more discussion about and more academic research and just interest in is the writers of these films.
Yeah.
I just recently I was on one of my friends' shows and we talked about Takashi Kimura or Karuo Mabuchi. And like his whole story alone is just so interesting to look into because of the pen name and the secrecy of his life. And he did Matango and Hedera and even wrote drafts for Gigan, which eventually bled into Megalon. And there's such an interesting treasure trove of information and lack thereof. That just interests like me, myself, and I a lot. Because there's Shinichi Sekizawa and Kimura-san were the two major Showa writers. And one thing I will forever love that David Callett, he's a film historian, that he highlighted in his Ghidorah, the Three-Headed Monster commentary, was Shinichi Sekizawa. And the differences between him and Kimura and how Sekizawa's outlook on life was more positive and Kimura's was a little more dark. And it creates such an interesting dynamic. Matango, one of the greatest Toho science fiction films, one of the greatest Japanese horror films. And I wish
love it so much. Yeah,
I love it. One of the most interesting things for me about that film is the proto J horror concepts you see in that film.
Right. It's definitely interesting because like so much early Japanese horror, the things that were made, like in the late 1940s and 1950s, they really feel like they're out of the world of folklore. Until right about the time of Godzilla, Matango, and other things like that. I mean, it's Japanese horror. Godzilla doesn't really fit squarely into the horror camp, but there's definitely elements of fear and horror in them. Horror begins to kind of move off in a different direction right about that time. So
Mhm.
I know I totally get what you're saying. Like some of that early Japanese horror, also like Kobayashi, Masaki Kobayashi's film Kwaidan. It's like an
Beautiful.
early masterpiece of Japanese horror, but it's just one of the most gorgeous movies that you can
Mhm.
possibly imagine. I mean, I've never seen a horror film that's done with such kind of like loving care to the cinematography. It was truly original.
Okay, you mentioned it, so we're gonna talk about it quite on.
Ooh, okay.
Oh,
Oh, yay! I love it.
I so I saw it for the first time, I want to say 2 years ago.
Okay.
Fell in love.
Uh-huh.
Absolutely fell in love.
Yeah.
Um,
Good.
one of the opening one with the samurai and the black hair.
Yes.
That's black hair. I remember one thing that David Khaled, again, amazing film historian,
Uh-huh.
long black hair, such a iconic thing for Japanese horror, right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
your
Right. We see that all.
Kayakos, yeah.
Yeah, we see that all the way to like Ring with
Mhm.
Sadako and the character with the long black hair over her face. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
then you've got stuff like is it Koichi the Earless, correct?
Hoichi, the earless. That's
Koichi,
right. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Um,
Nashi Hoichi in Japanese. Uh-huh.
which that section, I was stunned by
It's
how
an
beautiful.
It's amazing. That is really the heart of that movie. I've got to say, I've got a special love for that particular story in my heart. Um, for listeners who don't know about it, it's a story about a monk in sort of medieval Japan who is living at a place where the souls of the Taira warriors, Heike warriors, who had lost in a big naval battle, were enshrined, and there's this young man who's very well known at the temple for performing the stories of the defeat of the Taira clan, and so the ghosts of some of the Taira clan come and visit him and say, "Hey, will you sing to us our own story?" They don't let on that they're ghosts, and so he goes and he sings, the story of these people's downfall to them. Anyway, it's an amazing story, and then it just goes in such kind of quirky, wild directions from there that some absolutely unforgettable scenes. I'm especially in love with that particular story because when I went to Japan as a 15-year-old, the high school that I went to was just really like within about a mile of that particular shrine that's shown there in the film. So like I had walked by it like all the time. I knew the story, I knew what the shrine looked like, and to see that story brought to life in such a beautiful fashion, that film just that made me fall in love with that movie instantly.
Oh, that's amazing. I
Yeah.
and one of the interesting things about Kwaidan is
Uh-huh.
it wasn't written by a Japanese. It was written by Lafcadio Hearn.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Lafcadio Hearn was such an interesting fellow. He was born in Greece to a Greek mother and an Irish father, then grew up in Ireland, then came to the U.S. He lived in Cincinnati and then also somewhere in Louisiana, I think in New Orleans. Also went and lived in the Caribbean. He was just this kind of like wandering guy who loved to kind of like live with people from different cultures. Um, and so he somehow managed to make his way to Japan, and there he became a famous English teacher, and married a Japanese woman, and took a Japanese name, Japanese citizenship, and lived in Japan until the end of his life. So Kwaidan is a series of stories that he collected while he was there in Japan. Probably his wife helped him collect some of the stories, and helped him understand the stories somewhat. But yeah, totally fascinating figure, just an amazing life.
And talking about horror, and you brought it up,
Yeah.
and this is something I will forever love that happened was when you dive, especially if you're into the kaiju genre,
Mhm.
diving into the horror genre is
Uh-huh.
almost, I would say, a requirement because of just how much context and
Yeah, yeah,
understanding you can get.
yeah,
One of
absolutely.
one of the best examples for me was Shutsuke Kaneko's GMK, Godzilla Mothra King
Ah,
Ghidorah Giant Monsters All Out Attack.
uh-huh, uh-huh.
The opening of that film is structured more so like a Japanese horror film of the time
Mm, mm,
than a giant monster movie.
mhm.
Um,
Interesting. That
the
makes sense.
moments when they're in the forest where the trees
Uh-huh,
disappear um,
uh-huh,
feels like it's taken straight out of something like a Uzumaki or
uh-huh, uh-huh.
um, those Japanese horror films of the time. And
Yeah,
Kaneko-san himself was he had directed horror,
yes.
Pyrokinesis, God's Left Hand, Devil's Right, um,
Mm,
various Japanese horror films. And so once you add the context of J horror, huge at the time, right? 1998 was
yeah,
Ring,
uh-huh.
Ju-on was 2001, the first one.
Somewhere around there. I don't remember the year offhand, but yeah,
Um, but J horror blew up. And then
yeah.
in 2002, you had Gore Verbinski's The Ring remake, right? So
Right, right.
it was right before J horror took the route of we're making this to exploit it for American
Mm,
audiences. So you get this really rich, like horror-filled film for a Godzilla movie, and
uh-huh.
I think a lot of Godzilla fans just it goes right over their head. They don't know that.
Huh,
Um,
huh. Interesting. Yeah, yeah. It's interesting to think about the divisions like between horror, science fiction, and a lot of these things that we think of as kind of very different genres today. I think you probably know even more than I do about contemporary films and the way that those kind of things lay out and the kind of cartography of our imagination. But like I spent a lot of time studying like the literature of the early part of the 20th century, and it was, and I'm really interested in popular fiction and horror too. I just love it. One of the writers that I wrote my dissertation about, in fact, was a guy by the name of Edogawa Rampo. And if you hear his name, it sounds a lot like Edgar Allan Poe, Edogawa
mhm.
Rampo. He took his pen name from Edgar Allan Poe because he loved his dark, horrific stories so much. And anyway, so I spent a lot of time reading Edogawa Allan Poe, and it was amazing to me to kind of realize that, like, in when he was writing the 1920s and 1930s, implanting the seeds for these kind of stories that would blossom into various genres, like you know um, he there wasn't necessarily like a very clear distinction between like boys adventure stories and mystery fiction and horror and kind of weird monster fiction. Like those things all sort of like kind of come together and overlap in these really kind of organic and funny ways, I think, for us modern readers. I think we have very clear expectations. Like, we pick up a Stephen King novel and we know that there's going to be frightening moments and there's probably going to be a monster or whatever. But we have very clear expectations about like where genres begin and end. But as you kind of like trace back through Japanese cultural historical production, like a literary and a film cinematic production, like those, like, until like 1960 or 70, like all those kind of clear divisions weren't necessarily there. Like
Mhm.
they were all those things were overlapping in really interesting and kind of productive ways. And I think that that's one of the reasons, like these early kind of Japanese horror slash adventure slash monster films are so fun, because they kind of defy a lot of our expectations.
Mhm. Yeah, and even more so, to add on to that, another one that I learned a little bit more about when I took some theater classes, and I had a
Uh-huh.
my instructor. He went to Britain for a
Uh-huh.
couple years to study in Britain, and he's worked with various people. He took a lesson on kabuki plays,
Ah. Uh-huh.
And so he was explaining like how to practice for kabuki, you would be given a time limit of like 30 minutes, and for 30 minutes you would have to stay in one position and like
Oh.
do very very dramatic and like big poses.
Interesting.
And then, once you look at that context and you kind of twist it a little bit, you think about, wait a minute, Hideo Nakajima, like
Yeah. Yeah.
long periods of time in a suit doing very dramatic poses.
Yeah. Yeah.
Suddenly it's
Yeah.
like these suit actors they're acting as if they're in a kabuki play, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned kabuki. I hadn't gone there in this conversation yet, but yeah, kabuki is another kind of really totally fascinating repository of ideas that were then picked up later on. Like you earlier in this conversation, you mentioned the images of long hair and the way that they occur, in modern Japanese horror. But if you go back a couple of centuries to the very super famous ghost story Yotsuya Kaidan, the Yotsuya ghost stories, there's it's one of Japan's most famous ghost stories, and I can't remember the year off the top of my head, but yeah, it's about a story about a woman who is poisoned by her very unfaithful and cruel lover, and then the most horrific scene in the film is when she's combing her own hair, and the poison is that's killing her is making her hair fall out, and she realizes how horrible she's become, how awful and ugly she's become, and she weeps on and cries out in agony on stage as in her final moments. But yeah, like so there's like another example of how like images that have deep roots in Japanese culture, carry through across the distance of not just decades, but centuries.
Mhm. And I honestly, one of my favorite things, and I'm sure you can understand this. So as I mentioned, I worked on the Blu-ray for Yuzo. So it's
Yes.
a film about this monster called Virus King during the
Mm.
COVID-19 pandemic.
Hmm.
And so there's and the his tail is designed to look like a coronavirus. So there's some obvious, this is representing coronavirus, and then you
Uh-huh.
kind of have to analyze it from there.
Uh-huh.
So for my commentary,
Uh-huh.
I went to NHK, and
Uh-huh.
I read through, I want to say it was about 100,000 articles about their COVID updates, anything
Wow.
they added. Um, and so from there, I got to understand some of the context, the events that happened to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe during the time, the
Mm.
Prime Minister Suga that took office right after him, the political turmoil going on in Japan at the time, um, and just how bad things got. And we have a movie where at the end of it, there's no government presence. It's up to the people to
Ugh.
come together to fight the virus, right?
Wow.
And then suddenly you're like, wait a minute. This is what like the whole thing about COVID was. Like the people have
Yeah.
to come together, they have to follow what they need to do, follow the proper precautions, and that's how you beat the virus. You beat the virus king, right?
Hmm.
Um
Yeah. Yeah.
so
That makes a
learning
lot of sense.
that context is, I wish, and this is something like on Kaiju Conversation, Rex and I try to do is uh add that context, provide some information to understand why things are the way they are.
Nice.
Uh,
Yeah.
and oh, go ahead, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, like, this semester I taught a class at Western Michigan University in which we watched a whole bunch of different Godzilla movies as one unit, and I listened to a couple of your conversations just to kind of get a sense of like what people were saying about these movies. So keep up the good work, man.
Thank you. Uh,
Yeah.
I really do appreciate that. And
Sure.
so, I've also heard that you have done some pretty extensive research and have done some stuff, and we share the I would say amazing honor of being able to provide a commentary. I've heard you did a amazingly good commentary on Sancho the Bailiff, correct?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I did the Criterion Collections commentary for that film. There was it was a really fun experience for me. I'd never done anything like that before. In When I did the commentary for that particular film, a gorgeous film, by the way, like very different than the Toho movies. It's not like a kaiju movie at all. It's a very sad, kind of melodramatic film set in Japan's medieval but based on a very famous folktale, Sekkyobushi, a kind of oral narrative that was delivered by Buddhist itinerant monks and performers. They'll go from town to town. So it was based on an old story. But yeah, just an incredible film. I ended up in that film talking a lot about like the content of the film, like the kind of cultural background of what was happening in the story, and how the story was rewritten multiple times in order to get to the version of the film that we know. I didn't talk as much about the film history and the film camera angles and those kind of cinematographic decisions, because originally the plan was to have another scholar kind of come in and give a second commentary about those things, but in the end, for whatever reason, that didn't happen. So it just ended up being me. But anyway, yeah, it was so much fun. I love doing that sort of thing.
It's probably because you did such a good job. They were like, we can't we can't do anybody else.
Well, I don't know about that, but yeah, no. When I think back about it, there's so many things I wish I would have said, like, oh, that camera angle here, or ooh, that little decision over there, But hey, you know, hindsight is 2020. But yeah, doing a commentary is so much fun because it's like this, like talking with your friend about a movie, as you're watching it together and pointing out things. It's great. Yeah.
And it really does offer such a amazing opportunity to, like you said, provide that context,
Yeah. Yeah.
For Yuzo, I went about it like, yes, of course, talking about how the movie is made is important.
Uh-huh.
It's a movie.
Uh-huh.
But that context behind it, I think, in a way, is almost as important, if not more, because
Oh yeah.
that provides the much needed. That's reading in between the lines of the script, right? That's where
right. Absolutely.
that's where it's all at.
Yeah, definitely. I spent a lot of time thinking about this kind of thing as I was working on translating the Godzilla novelization. I mean, I'm sure that many of your listeners already know the story of the Lucky Dragon #5, being bombed out there in the Bikini Atoll in Marshall Islands, in 1954, and how that inspired the making of the film Godzilla. But it was really fun, like thinking about that as I was working in the text and thinking like, oh yeah, well this scene or this particular moment is a clear reference to that, or how are those images kind of implanted into the text. So yeah, it's so much fun. It's amazing how you begin to see things in a completely new light.
Mhm. No, and that's the beauty of it. Is it does
Yeah.
it alters. I think for somebody like I want to get into film. That's my trajectory. That's what I'm working towards.
Nice.
I think one of the beautiful things about Japanese culture, and you can see this through their writing, through their statues, through their sculpting, through their art. Every little stroke counts. In writing Japanese, the way you write your strokes is important. Like there's an
Yeah.
actual way to do it.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Right. Right. And people know if you don't do it right.
mhm,
I've
mhm.
I've had when I've been writing with a brush in Japanese, I've been corrected many times, like, oh, hey, you should have put that stroke first. You lift a little bit over here. Yeah, it's fun, but that's good. Yeah,
And
people do
I
things for a reason.
exactly, and that's the beautiful thing is seeing and understanding that reasoning, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
every little thing matters.
Right.
Um, and sure, it in some ways people could consider it, being a perfectionist, but in other ways, I feel like it's just it adds to the depth, right?
Mhm.
The I think one of the reasons why Japanese cinema is, if you talk to some people, they'll say it's primitive, but if you talk to other people, they'll say like they've produced some of the most beautiful, thought-provoking, and amazing films of all time.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's interesting. Like, not so long ago, I was talking about the famous Japanese horror film House, by Obayashi, and I was showing it to my students, and some of them like were like, "Oh my god!" In some ways, the filming is so kind of quirky and Scooby-Doo like.
mhm,
But in other ways, it's just like absolutely just mind-bogglingly fresh and brilliant. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's interesting how sometimes even the same work can be seen in different ways.
right.
But anyway, yeah. Sorry.
No, you're fine. And I House is a great example, and I think one of the things that I love about horror, and I think this is more of a universal thing for the horror genre, is you can see throughout time changes in approaches, changes in
Mhm.
how they go about things. Um, you know, the 40s, 50s, and 60s, if we're talking Japanese films, were more based on folklore, more set in like Edo, your Jedi Geki esque films. The 70s brought more of the Roman porno films or the more experimental stuff.
Uh-huh.
Once you get into the 80s, you see kind of the rise of the indie productions. One of my personal favorite films, Tetsuo, the Iron Man,
Oh
uh,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
stuff like Guinea Pig, um, which birthed a whole nother genre. And then you can see the development of like these indie extreme films into like Toei's V Cinema stuff, and
Mhm,
eventually you get to stuff like Ring and whatnot.
mhm.
Um, and it is very interesting, and you see this with kaiju stuff too. The development from old, the older style of filmmaking in Japan to the modern
Yeah,
day.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and
Definitely, definitely.
I think one of the most interesting things to that is you do see those older films, and a lot of them are based in that folklore and
Mhm,
whatnot.
mhm.
And in the modern day, you see how they try to recontextualize it to present day. I want to say it's Takashi Shimizu, director of
Mm,
Ju-On,
mm.
recently did a film that was about VR and how
Ah,
there was
okay.
ghosts in VR.
Ah.
Um, so kind of the horror of like the VHS for Ring now is
Uh-huh.
like VR. Um,
Yeah. It's
and
interest
you go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's interesting how much anxiety we seem to have about technology.
Hmm.
It's I mean, it's not just there, but like, so much cultural production in the US too is about, concern about the rise of AI.
Hmm.
Like ever since Terminator. Maybe even before that. But yeah, yeah, I'm fascinated at the way that technology appears over and over again in people's concepts of what's horrifying.
you know Speak like technology. If we're talking technology, Tetsuo the Iron Man, going back to it, that film is all about technology and metal.
Right,
um
right. and a kind of the horror of a hybridized body.
Mhm.
There's definitely a lot of body horror in that film. I mean, no question about it. But yeah, like that very interesting kind of theoretical question of where does the human end and the machine begin? It's a really interesting one. Some people have argued that we are already cyborgs. We have been for a long time. Ever since humanity picked up a tool, perhaps we've been a cyborg in a certain kind of sense. So yeah, it's a really interesting idea.
That is interesting. I've never thought that's actually a really interesting thought.
Yeah, tools are just nothing but an extension of our bodies in a way, an added function. But yeah, I was kind of stunned when I encountered that idea for the first time that we are already cyborgs.
Mhm.
And I think that that Tetsuo, the the Iron Man, Tetsuo literally means Iron Man, right? It's all about that kind of anxiety.
So I've been talking a lot about films, but I hear
Yeah.
you're a huge film buff.
Yeah, well, yeah, I love film for sure. Yeah, for sure.
So, out of curiosity, what are some
Yeah.
of your favorite? Has there ever been a film where like you've watched it, you loved it, and then eventually you later went back to it and realized some more of the context and kind
Oh,
of
yeah.
viewed it in a whole new light?
Oh, like every film I've ever watched, practically. I mean, every time I watch a film for the first time, I'm just so caught up in the story and the visuals and the filmmaking that I think I'm kind of appreciating it at the surface level. But on the second rewatching, then you begin to think more about camera angles and music choices, use of sound, camera angles. Did I already say that? But things like that. I mean, you begin to kind of like watch the artistry of it, and then upon repeated viewings, then you begin to think more about the cultural context and so on. And so yeah, so I mean, virtually every film that I've ever loved, I could say that I've gone through that process of watching it in different ways as I rewatch it over and over again. Yeah, I gotta
Okay.
say, like, we were talking about the Criterion Collection earlier. I just love the Criterion Collection so much, because, they're just so good at contextualizing so many of those things for us. The commentaries are so often wonderful, and, yeah, like, so many of their kind of extra little, snippets about, film history are incredibly valuable.
Mhm.
We were talking about House earlier, and there's a Criterion Collection has produced a really fantastic little short, maybe 5 minute, tiny film that's all about Obayashi's kind of obsession with the atomic bomb. Obayashi, who made House, was grew up in Onomichi, which is just a town just a little bit over from Hiroshima. So people who fled Hiroshima came to Onomichi, to where he was living, and so he saw firsthand, the horror and the aftermath of the Hiroshima bombings, and that affected him hugely. And although House doesn't really is not a film about the bomb per se, there are these like really interesting ways in which he's worked it into the film, in ways that aren't necessarily terribly obvious. But I'm not sure, like I would have, picked up on that if it wasn't for the Criterion Collection pointing it out for me. So
Mhm.
yeah, definitely, definitely. I mean, Godzilla too. I mean, there were when I watched Godzilla 1954 for the first time when I was little. I definitely wasn't thinking about Lucky Dragon number five. I didn't know such a thing existed. I think I barely even knew that the hydrogen bomb was a thing. The first time that I saw it as a little tyke. So yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So, what is, I've kind of mentioned some of my favorite Japanese films. So, what are some of your favorite Japanese films?
Yeah. So earlier I mentioned a really fantastic movie called sorry, fantastic writer called Edogawa Rampo, and there's a film by him that I think is like almost criminally underrated. It was made in, I'm just double checking the year, 1994, and it's called The Mystery of Rampo, and it's built out of a whole bunch of Edogawa Rampo stories. that are kind of woven into the text of the film, sometimes with animation, sometimes with live action, and then that's kind of woven into a story that was inspired by Rampo's own life. It is a stunningly gorgeous film, and I think it's like criminally underrated. Everyone that I've ever showed it to was just completely bowled away by it. So, you know, I it was made in, since it was made in 1994, it was kind of like made in that sort of weird moment when not a lot of stuff, not everything got transferred over to DVD and Blu-ray real quickly. And I don't know about the publication history of the Mystery of Rampo, but I haven't seen it around on any streaming service, and I'm just like, oh, I want to shake the world and get that in front of everybody's eyes. It's a fantastically beautiful movie, just stunning.
Interesting. See, the only like project or work that I know that's related to him is Teru Ishii's Horrors of Malformed Men.
Yes. That's right. That's based on a novel called Koto no Oni, The Demon of the Lonely Isle, and it's about it's a very, very fascinating novel. It's like one of my favorites by Edogawa Rampo. It's one of his early long novels, and it's the only one that stars an openly gay detective. And so for that reason alone, being written in the around 1930, I forget the exact year, that alone makes it pretty extraordinary. So yeah, totally amazing. But yeah, in that film that you just mentioned, Ishii's The Horrors of Malformed Men, there's a lot of scenes about these people who go to an island and they encounter this kind of mad doctor who has been turning people into these kind of strange creatures through surgery and experimentation. And that's directly picked up out of Rampo's novel. Rampo in turn got that idea from H.G. Wells, from The Island of Dr. Moreau, one of H.G. Wells' famous pieces of science fiction / horror. So yeah, like here's again one of these kind of examples of a story that has like these very complicated like routes of production. H.G. Wells to Rampo to Ishii. Yeah, it's wonderful. I love that movie that The Horrors of Malformed Men, for a lot of reasons, not just because it's based on the work of Edogawa Rampo, and because it's so goddamn weird. It is just a fucking weird piece of work. But it also is starring some of the most famous and dancers of Japan at that time. Some people that were involved with a kind of dance called Buto, that's sometimes translated as like the dance of darkness or something, but a very kind of quirky, non-traditional dance style it's almost kind of like the anti-ballet. Ballet is all kind of about showing off the beauty of the human body to its extreme. Buto is kind of about showing the profundity and depth of the human experience and all of its ugliness. And so the actors will do very quirky things on stage, kind of claw at the air and do all sorts of interesting things. And the famous dancers who appear in that film, are perfect for that film because they're so good at kind of being the surgically modified, creatures on that island. It's for that reason alone. It's just incredibly fun. It's a bizarre piece of cultural history.
And I another one of his films that I watched was Blind Woman's Curse. And you even see some of his style from Malformed Men in that film as well. And that was also another film that I thought was really interesting to watch. Nice. And I believe that's an adaptation of a story as well, if I remember correctly.
So Edogawa Rampo, I think, was part of the inspiration for it. I haven't seen that film, so I'll have to put that on my list of things to watch right away. Can you tell us off the bat where to find it? Is it on a streaming service?
So I don't know if it's on streaming, but Arrow Video did put it out on Blu-ray.
Okay. Okay.
And I want to say there's a there's a commentary track on that, and in that they talk extensively about Ishii's work. Prior to that, they talk about Malformed Men a lot,
Uh-huh.
and kind of the context of why the film is the way it is.
Mm.
And it's very interesting because while it's a horror film to an extent, it's also a Yakuza film.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's a revenge story. So you
Mm.
have these three things intertwining into a film that is kind of I was very shocked when I watched. I was not at all what I thought it would be.
Okay.
It was the actress for Lady Snowblood. What's her name?
Oh, Kaji Miyako?
That sounds right. This
Yeah.
was her first leading role as well. This was prior to Lady Snowblood, so she's the lead
Okay.
actress in the
Yeah.
Blind Woman's Curse.
Yeah.
And so they talk a bit about that and how, you know, that would eventually lead to her doing Lady Snowblood, which even that's an adaptation. I'd love to read the original manga. I think Dark Horse put it out. But I'd love to read the original Lady Snowblood manga. But no, that
More
Blu-ray,
projects.
that Blu-ray for Blind Woman's Curse was really interesting and enlightening.
Okay.
I imagine if they put it out on Blu-ray, I wouldn't be surprised if it's on either like Shudder or Arrow
Okay.
Video Player. Probably,
Okay.
maybe.
I'll definitely have to track it down. Yeah. Yeah. There's so much to see, and it's so much to read.
Mhm.
Isn't life fun? know-
So go ahead.
So since we were talking about things that were inspired by Edogawa Rampo, this great writer, there's another quite recent film called Imomushi, the Caterpillar, which was based on one of Rampo's most famous and controversial stories. The story was written, I can't remember the year off the top of my head, but in the 1920s or something like that. And it's a gut wrenching, kind of horrifying tale about a guy who was a soldier in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905, and he's horribly disfigured. Like his arms and legs are lost in war, and so basically his body is kind of just his torso and his head, and so he's kind of like, his wife kind of treats him like a big live human caterpillar, and mistreats him horribly, but also uses him sexually too, in some kind of surprising ways. I'm amazed that this book got by the censors when it was first published. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit onto a tangent here, but at a certain point during World War II, when Edogawa Rampo tried to reprint the story, his censors did not let him reprint it. And so he was so upset by this that he decided that he was going to be quiet. He wasn't going to publish during World War II. So he wasn't going to do anything that would support the war effort. But anyway, this got turned into a movie, I think around 2010 or something like that. And it's just it is a super powerful film. It's difficult to watch in places, as one might imagine, but it's one of the most powerful anti-war statements I've ever seen on film.
Huh.
Period. Yeah. And the cinematography again is really, really good, but it's a difficult film to watch, but definitely horror, definitely disturbing. Yeah, if you thought Tetsuo was disturbing, boy, when you see the caterpillar, you'll be like, whoa.
I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Anyway, yeah, there's so much good film out there. Japan makes so much good film, and I just wish that that we, like, Americans more broadly, would embrace it. Yeah.
See, it's funny you bring that up. So back when COVID was, I'd say about halfway through COVID, I was like, you know what? I want to watch any and every Japanese genre film that's ever got subtitles that's been released stateside.
Well, you must have been busy.
So far I've stuck to science fiction, fantasy, kaiju.
Uh-huh.
In the last year or so, I've started branching off into horror as well,
Mhm.
while also juggling all the things I'm doing. So
Hmm,
it's been kind of crazy. Um,
nice.
but I've been able to watch so many interesting um, films, whether they have such outlandish concepts
Mhm.
or they're actually really interesting and serious and thought provoking. And it's even led on. I've started watching some Kurosawa. I've only watched a
Mm.
handful of his.
Oh,
Um,
you got to. You've got to. It's funny because,
um,
like, for so many people, that's the starting point into Japanese cinema. Your course has been the reverse.
the last Kurosawa film I watched was Throne of Blood, which was
Uh-huh.
amazing.
Amazing.
Um,
Truly a masterpiece. Yeah.
I wish that I wish that Ishiro Honda and Akira Kurosawa did full blown horror films between Matango
Oh.
and Throne of Blood. Just that idea of those two doing, even if it was like a Ghost of Yotsuya or something, just
Uh-huh.
it would have been so good.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. In Throne of Blood, some of those scenes where the Throne of Blood is Macbeth,
mhm.
by Shakespeare, sort of transplanted into medieval Japan, and it's so successful. I think it's one of the most successful adaptations of Shakespeare that I've ever seen. It's truly a work of art, and yeah, anyone who's listening, and I can't recommend it highly enough. Kurosawa too is, I mean, so important in the history of film. Like, I mean, without him, we wouldn't have Star Wars. The Hidden Fortress by Kurosawa that inspired George Lucas to come up with the idea for Star Wars. In the Hidden Fortress, it's a story about a big war, a big battle that's happening, but the main characters are these two kind of sort of bumbling figures. One's kind of tall, one's short, a little bit like C3PO and R2D2. And so they kind of happen into the middle of this big drama that's going on along them and around them. And so, George Lucas, picked up the idea of telling Star Wars in that same fashion, using these kind of side characters as our way into this very big tale.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I'm the emphasis of like my emphasis on Kurosawa. I just don't think he could be better. He's so
Now,
fantastic.
I've only seen, so my Kurosawa films are Hidden Fortress, Throne of Blood, Seven Samurai, Rashomon, Yojimbo. I
Uh-huh,
own Sanjiro, haven't watched it yet.
uh-huh.
And I own Dreams, but I haven't watched it yet.
It's
Um,
beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so those are, I think that's kind of like the great, like the best hits right there
okay.
that you've named. Yeah. Rashomon, if people haven't seen it, I mean, that is truly like a landmark piece of cinema. I often see it on lists of like the best films ever made. It often appears like in the top 10. Sometimes it even
Mhm.
appears in number one space. But yeah, I mean, Rashomon was just revolutionary. It captured the attention of the Venice Film Festival, the European critics, and really kind of opened up a space for other Japanese filmmakers to emerge, like Mizoguchi. Who was the director of Sancho the Bailiff, which we mentioned earlier. He wouldn't probably have received quite as much international acclaim if Kurosawa hadn't already been starting to pave the way for him.
Mhm.
Mizoguchi was
And
well known at home, but yeah.
right, and that's such an important part. Is like, correct me if I'm wrong, but Rashomon ended up winning an honorary Oscar, correct?
I don't remember the award history there, but I mean, uh, I I think it might have.
I
Yeah,
think
I,
it
I
at
should know
least
that,
got
but
nommed. It got nommed for something at least. Um,
yeah, it was certainly well known. And it did receive some attention in Europe as well. Yeah.
And you can trace that even Rashomon, not Rashomon, Kurosawa to Kaiju is such an easy bridge, right?
Hmm.
But even now, like in the modern day, it's even more relevant because you have Rashomon brought Japanese films to the world,
Hmm.
and here we
Yeah.
have like Godzilla minus one, that
Yeah.
one, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Such an important part of Japanese history, winning that special effects
Oh,
Oscar,
right.
right?
Right. Yeah. I felt like I could practically hear the collective cheer in Japan going up from where I'm living in Michigan. Yeah. Yeah. That was I think really exciting.
And
Um,
it was really novel too because unfortunately kaiju as a genre has that narrative of, oh, giant cardboard buildings and people in costumes destroying them,
right.
right?
Right. Right. Right.
And
Um,
no, go
I
ahead,
was
go ahead.
I was just going to say, so not so long ago, I was with Huria Bing, the guy who's the suit actor who played he played who played Ultraman, for many years, and he was telling me that, like, that all the none of the things that he had ever done won any awards, but one of the kind of sort of fan events that he went to, one of the other people who was involved with it got an award, and the guy stood up there and cried because he's like, I've spent my entire career, working on these popular things, which people have they never give the awards to, and so yeah, so like, I mean, there's this whole sort of like field of cultural production out there that's kind of not considered uh, like a subject for awards and for high critical nomination. So yeah, the fact that Godzilla minus one won an Academy Award, that's huge. That's huge. Also, too, I mean, the fact that Miyazaki's film, The Boy and the Heron, too, also won an Academy
Mhm.
Award at the same Academy Awards. I mean, it was a great night for Japan, no question about it.
And
Yeah.
even though is it Perfect Days didn't win, it still got nominated too, which
Yes. Yes. Yeah, the actor in that, Yakusho Koji, is just like one of Japan's best actors as far as I'm concerned. A truly, truly great guy. Yeah.
so it's very interesting to see that progression. And I is
Yeah.
speaking more not as a kaiju fan for the night
Uh-huh.
that Godzilla minus one won, um but more so on just I have tried to slowly, not necessarily disassociate myself, but establish myself more as a Japanese cinema fan, um
Great.
trying to
Nice.
learn and understand and love that nation's filmography, um which has been a huge undertaking, but I would never change it for the world.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
Being able to see then suddenly this huge wave of interest,
Uh-huh.
um and being able to see all these companies putting out Japanese films.
Yeah.
Criterion's announced they're doing Perfect Days. um
Oh, okay. I hadn't heard that. Good.
they're
Excellent.
they're doing that. There's been some talk that minus one might end up going through Janus and Criterion, which would be
Hmm.
amazing.
Yeah.
um Seeing
Yeah.
this huge interest
Uh-huh.
um in just Japanese cinema
Yeah.
has been so rewarding.
Yeah.
uh
Yeah. Yeah,
Now,
me too. Me too. I'm so glad. I'm so glad that Japanese cinema is having a moment, because I care about it, and and it produces more interest in Japan. We have more people studying Japanese. It creates a good cycle.
and that's something that as I continue to develop and grow into either helping bring the stuff over, or just sitting down and talking on a live stream or a podcast about it.
Uh-huh.
It's been very rewarding to like open this up to more people.
Oh,
um
good. Good.
you
I'm
know
glad
and
I'm glad to hear that.
And one of the things that, this is something I need to dive into more myself, but you have been kind enough to aid in this, is bringing over that literature, right?
Oh, uh-huh. Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I I
and
I love to translate. Yeah, it's incredibly rewarding.
and something that I think a lot of people don't know is like the origin of the term kaiju, right?
Mm. Mhm.
Um, actually was in a Chinese story, Fantastic Creatures of the Mountain and Seas.
Mm. So yeah,
Um,
so my understanding is that the word kaiju does date back to classical Chinese, and I'm not sure exactly if what the first instance of that particular word is, but the first character kai in Chinese is read gui and means weird, and so when you're talking about classical Chinese, sometimes it gets a little bit complicated when you've got like a two character compound, like so written with one character, the one gui, I mean, read same in Japanese kai, and the other one ju. I forget how that's read in Chinese, but because the word gui is alone can function as an adjective. So
mhm,
it's so sometimes in classical Chinese it's a little bit unclear about whether the words just happen to be next to each other or actually they're kind of lexicalized as a single word. So so I mean that's just one little kind of like wrinkle and the difficulty in trying to figure out the exact origin. But anyway, but there's no question that it has Chinese roots. And the oldest usage that I've found, or that I know of anyway, I found in the Nihongo Daijiten, which is kind of like the Japanese version of the like the Oxford English Dictionary. It's a huge dictionary. It's like I've got it in my office. It's like that big on the shelf, and it's got like like very lots and lots of examples of the use of each word. And so there are some samples of the word kaiju being used in the 1700s. Um, so the word has been around in Japanese for a while, but it doesn't really seem to have been popular. That popular. It does seem like the Godzilla movies really helped to kind of repopularize it as a term. Like all of the early Godzilla movie posters, they always talk about kaiju this, kaiju that, in the text. Like the 1954 original poster, I think you can probably see it easily, like on Wikipedia. I think it's on the Wikipedia page, but like it's got the word kaiju, there right there in the text
mhm.
describing the film. So so like the Godzilla films definitely helped to repopularize that word, or at least kind of make it not just like an old niche thing, from way back in the
Right.
classics, but kind of bringing it into the modern age.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
I
I love
know.
the
Like
fact that
in no, go
oh,
ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I was just going to add on too. I love the fact that the word kaiju has slipped into the English vocabulary too. I was just reading earlier today, the Kaiju Preservation Society by John Scalzi. It's fun to see kaiju right there in the title. So.
No, it is, and I so again back to Khaled. In like some of the old titles, like the actual titles, you have Sandai Kaiju Chikyu Saidai no Kessen,
Uh huh.
three giant monsters, Earth's greatest battle.
Uh huh.
Um, so like in there is San Dai Kaiju, three giant monsters.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so it was used in those titles, and they were using those terms, and that's something that once you get into like Ultraman, they kind of started to drop those. They would call them terrible
Mm.
monsters, or
Oh,
something else, kind of changing the idea of using just kaiju. Um,
interesting. Mm.
but then talking in the modern context, Guillermo del Toro's Pacific Rim,
Uh
you
huh.
know, modernized and popularized the term kaiju
Uh huh.
for American audiences and international audiences.
Uh huh.
And if
Yeah.
you follow that, that was the beginning of the modernized popular way of calling giant monsters kaiju. We even see it in like James Gunn's The Suicide Squad. They say like we've got a kaiju
really?
now. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't remember that. That's funny. Huh. Nice.
So it's really cool to see this inherently Japanese term become a popular term. I believe tokusatsu, special effects filmmaking, just got adopted into Webster's dictionary
Oh, was
as
it?
like
Oh,
an
really?
actual
Okay.
English term.
Interesting. Yeah. Huh.
So
Huh.
it's really cool to see that stuff,
Yeah.
become actual like English terms,
Yeah.
using the
Yeah.
Japanese things.
It's true. It's
Um,
true. It was interesting when I was translating the Godzilla novelizations here. The word kaiju appears here and there throughout the text, and so I wondered what to do. Sometimes I translated it as monster. Sometimes I left the word kaiju, kind of as a way of saying like, look, I think we should all know this word. And and all of us in the world of fandom know the word and have known the word for a long time. I wanted to make sure that I was trying to speak to both audiences. Like I wanted this book to be read by both audiences. So I definitely wanted to sneak the word in kaiju in there as often as I could, but sometimes I did end up translating it just as monster or scary beast or something like that along the way. But yeah.
Now, before we start to wrap up, I do want to talk about this. We're talking about kaiju.
Yeah.
I've mentioned tokusatsu. Another off branch, another type of creature that I have grown to love and appreciate are yokai.
Oh yes. Uh-huh.
Um,
Yeah.
so for me, I didn't really get introduced to yokai until Arrow put out their Yokai Monsters box set, which
Okay.
had some amazing movies that I wish I had seen a long time ago.
What was in that set?
So you have yokai. So it's 100 monsters,
Uh-huh.
which I don't remember that one's Japanese title. Um,
Is it Hyaku Monogatari maybe? Or I don't, anyway.
maybe.
Y-
Um,
okay, anyway.
you have Spook Warfare, which is Yokai Daisenso,
Okay.
um, and then Along with Ghosts.
Okay.
Um, so those were late 60s Dai films
Uh-huh.
that featured yokai. You have the kappas in there, and you
Uh-huh.
have the is it not? It's not the Yuki Ono. It's the ba Bakunaku. The long necked woman.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Rokurokubi
Roku, yes,
is her
yes, there
name.
we
Yeah.
go.
Uh-huh.
And various other, like there's tons of yokai in these films, and
Yeah.
they're Edo period uh films, not taking place in the modern day, kind of
Mhm.
like Daimajin.
Oh
Um,
yes, yes. Uh-huh.
and
Yeah.
the first one is a horror film about an evil lord that the yokai take revenge on. The second one, Spook Warfare, is more of a adventure action movie with the yokai fighting other
Nice.
yokai, and then Along with Ghosts is the yokai helping some children
Uh-huh.
fight this evil lord that like killed their parents. And then Takashi Miike would later remake the franchise in Yokai Daisenso, or the Great
Yeah.
Yokai War as it's known.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Wild, crazy movie. Yeah. Based on the work of Mizuki Shigeru, one of the great
mhm,
yokai manga writers. Yeah, it's so much fun. I love the world of yokai because it's just endlessly inventive.
mhm.
There are so many yokai. There's so many quirky Japanese ghosts and quirky Japanese monsters. And there's an infinite supply of them. I think from your movie watching during the Edo period, the pre-modern period, there was a very popular pastime. especially common during the summer when it's very hot and humid, and everyone kind of needed a little scare, to kind of give them a chill or something like that. There's a popular pastime called Hyakumonogatari, or 100 Tales, where everyone would gather in a room, and they would each tell their yokai story, or each tell their own little ghost story, and then after each person told their story, they would blow out a candle. And so the idea was that by the time that everyone told their story and blew out their candle, then the room would be plunged into darkness, and then the yokai would really appear. So, I just mentioned this because, like, this is, I mean, there was this, like, so telling stories about yokai, telling stories about ghosts and monsters and all these kind of weird, funny, quirky Japanese creepy crawlies was so popular that it's no wonder that, if people were sitting around here telling story after story after story in the course of a single night, it's no wonder that we've just got this fantastic profusion of folk tales, of homespun stories about weird creatures. I couldn't love it more.
So that's actually, you just taught me something, because that's how they open 100 Monsters.
Okay, yeah, okay, all right. Okay, so there's a Japanese movie called, and I didn't realize actually that there was an English version of it, but there's a Japanese movie called Hyaku Monogatari. Hyaku meaning 100, and Monogatari means tales. And so, but this Hyaku Monogatari is this kind of like story of telling, like this way of telling ghost stories, with the idea that the ghost will kind of or something creepy or crawly or weird will kind of appear at the end. So yeah, it must be the same film. Yeah.
You just blew my mind.
Oh, right on. I just love this. I just love the fact that there's so many good yokai stories. If people are interested in yokai, there's a book that I'd really like to recommend. It was written by a scholar by the name of Michael Dillon Foster, and it's called The Book of Yokai. And he is a yokai scholar. He's dedicated his entire career to studying Japanese folklore. And he does such a good job of introducing the world of yokai studies. He talks about individual yokai tales, and helps to kind of wrap our head around where these all came from.
And that was The Book of Yokai by Michael Dillon Foster?
That's correct. Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
it's a great book. That's my Amazon cart right now.
Ooh, yeah, you'll love it. I promise. So part of the book is like dedicated to being like a kind of compendium. Like it tells you about individual yokai, but then it also talks about like how like why this is so popular in Japan. Going back in the day. How it's kind of carried over into the modern era, how there's been this entire commercial franchise dedicated to creating yokai stories and yokai figurines and, cute little yokai things that, that people will collect. That's good awesome stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
And so talking about yokai, a lot of my knowledge from it, so on that Arrow box set that I was talking about, they actually made a roughly 50-minute documentary about what yokai are and the origins of yokai.
Oh, great.
So they have a lot of people on there talking about it.
Nice.
Talking about how during the what period of Japan was that? It was the Meiji, during the Meiji restoration. They were trying to westernize Japan.
Yes.
And during that time, any like traditional Japanese thing would kind of be thrown out. They wanted to reinvent Japan. They wanted to bring it to the modern day. So
yeah. So some you're right. So during the Meiji period, some things were kind of set aside as sort of old, outdated fashions. I mean, certainly Japan did, of course, hold on to other traditions too. They didn't throw everything out, but it was definitely a time of revisiting all of culture, and that's kind of where we begin to get like a very hybridized Japanese culture that brings in elements of the West and keeps elements of tradition, but ultimately, it's not. It doesn't just make like a hybrid. It kind of creates something new in the process.
And during that time, one of the things that kind of got put to the wayside was the idea of yokai. And
Sure.
it wasn't until and so they didn't really tell those stories. They kind of started to die off. And except for, I want to say it was the author you talked about, that that popularized yokai in the early 1900s. And
Yes.
so, no, go ahead.
Yeah. I think you're right. Like, I think in the early part of the 20th century, people saw, some of these old folk tales as just kind of superstitious stuff, like stuff that the uneducated people in the countryside would talk about. I mean, there were scholars even early on that realized that this was a spectacularly wonderful repository of Japanese folk culture. So there's a folklorist by the name of Yanagita Kunio, who went around and wrote a great deal about yokai stories, and tried to trace their history and valued them a great deal. But that wasn't everybody. That wasn't everybody for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And so, actually, side tangent.
Yeah.
We talked about quite on earlier, and what you just brought up. I've noticed that there are a lot of those, especially folklore, where they like to adapt it and say like people went around to different regions of Japan or different rural areas and got different stories, and they compile all these stories into one. And I just love that because there are some very interesting short stories, and especially for like horror, especially I love the whole like these are true stories from around Japan that
we're Japan. I think we're really lucky, those of us who are Japanese scholars and or fans of Japan, because Japan, like more than just about any other country that I know intimately, it really values local culture and like distinctive local culture. Like if you go to Japan, and you go to any town, any place, any almost no matter how small it is, every town has its meibutsu, its famous thing, its thing that it's famous for. You often have food, like maybe one area is famous for its tangerines, another is famous for its seaweed, or whatever. And so every place has its kind of local thing, and people love it. People will like dive right in and want to buy the meibutsu from that place. And so that kind of like love of specificity and the uniqueness of individual places also translates into the world of folk tales and yokai. So yokai have roots in different parts of the country, and so people will claim like oh, this is our yokai. This is our town is famous for kappa, the water spirits, or and so people will claim that, and I think that that's really really exciting. Yeah. Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned the Great Yokai War, uh, which by Miike, the director Miike. And it was based on the work of a Japanese manga writer by the name Mizuki Shigeru in the Japanese order. Yeah, like if you go to his hometown, which is in the western part of Japan, on the Sea of Japan, you'll see like streets, like lined with yokai statues, and like people who are lovers of yokai, they all go there, and have their pictures taken with the yokai statues that he's, designed by him and made famous by him. So people love that like very specific local culture, and yeah, again, like I know I've said this a lot this time, but like, isn't that cool? Isn't that fun that there's so much kind of value? I mean, in this country too. I mean, I think that people like pay attention to the, like local urban legends and stuff to a certain extent. Like my partner's from New Jersey, and so like in New Jersey, the Jersey Devil is like a big thing, but yeah, like but not nearly to the same extent we pay attention to local culture like they do in Japan.
And I think that's just one of many, but I think one thing that draws people to Japanese culture um, is that attachment to folklore and to telling very almost personalized stories, and opening that up to a wider audience.
I hope so.
Even like Godzilla 54, one of the stories of that is Dr. Serizawa's fight with reality and what could be reality, and the fears of the war and what could happen with the oxygen destroyer, and that becomes one of the most interesting narratives throughout that film. And it all goes down to what I believe it's Ogata says, about how you have what could be you have fiction which could be reality,
Mhm.
and you have I'm trying to remember the line. It's such a good line.
Yeah. The but yeah, I mean, you're right that like one of the major things that I think is really interesting about Godzilla, the original Godzilla, is that quite complex and deep discussion of the ethics of the use of science. Like, why is it ethical to develop a scientific idea if it could potentially be perverted for nefarious reasons? If something could be turned into a weapon of mass destruction, is it worth being created at all? Is the scientific advancement that worth it? And certainly, I mean, in the wake of the development of the atomic and then hydrogen bombs, that was a question that, of course, Japan had lots of reason to ask.
And the quote, I looked it up. You have your fear, which might become reality, and you have Godzilla, which is reality, which is in regards to the Jacob just posted it here. Also, the chat, I'm sorry, we've just been diving into such deep conversations that I haven't been able to pick it up. But Jacob here, then you have a responsibility no man has ever faced. You have your fear, which might become reality, and you have Godzilla, which is reality. Talking about the balance of, is it worse to use the oxygen destroyer, or is it worse to keep Godzilla alive? Go ahead.
I was going to say that's a discussion that it appears in a sort of truncated form in the film. That all that discussion, I think, goes by fairly quickly in the film. In the book, I feel like those scenes are a bit longer. They're a bit more fleshed out, and I definitely get the impression that for Kayama, who was one of the major architects of the Godzilla story, that was a very serious consideration for him. Like at the very beginning of the book that I've translated, Kayama starts with a foreword, and he says, the reason that I'm writing this, the reason that I've become involved with this Godzilla story is because I'm an anti-nuclear activist. I think that we really need to think about science and what we're doing with science and in our modern world. Yeah.
And that's just that statement alone. Science in the modern world. The idea of yokai goes kind of against that concept of science. A lot of folklore goes against science, and we do see that show up in these films. Miike's The Great Yokai War. That film is about a evil yokai transforming other yokai into machines, and that fight for people, are they forgetting the stories of yokai and whatnot. And it is a very big topic, the idea of that. And we even see Godzilla -1. Godzilla starts off as a marine reptile dinosaur that gets irradiated by technology, and then he goes on his path of destruction, and it's science that ends up defeating him.
Mhm.
And we just talked about the fear of technology, the fear of that
Yeah.
throughout J-horror and all that. And there's another connection to like giant monster
Yeah.
movies, is that
Yeah.
fear of science or folklore. And it's
Yeah.
very interesting to think about that too.
It is, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this in relationship to Godzilla, the original movie, and book, because it in that work, science is both the bad guy and the salvation at the same time. It's the science of the H bomb that ultimately unleashes Godzilla, unleashes the destruction on his environment, his particular habitat that makes him then rampage across Japan. But then science also kind of provides this Deus ex machina kind of solution, this almost too straightforward to be believed kind of solution, that just sort of comes out of nowhere really, and solves the problem. Yeah, so I mean, so Godzilla. I mean, I think that the original film is showing the kind of double edged sword kind of nature of science. There's
And
also kind of some interesting passages in the book that I didn't make it into the movie, in which Yamane, the paleontologist, says, "We during the last war, during World War II, have caused such trouble to the rest of the world. If we were to research Godzilla, this is like our gift back to humanity to kind of make reparations for what we've done in the past." You can imagine that wouldn't make into the movie. It's probably a little bit too controversial, a little bit too strong, perhaps a little bit too leftist of a position to kind of admit that Japan had done wrong during World War II. But yeah, I mean that factored into the thinking of Kayama, the writer.
huh.
Yeah, yeah.
And
So for,
one other thing that I thought was really I love this aspect of 54 that I
uh-huh.
don't know if really any other film hits is Godzilla's origins with Odo Island,
Oh yes,
and
uh-huh. Yeah,
that folklore, that legend, the legend
yeah,
of Godzilla. Um,
yeah,
and in that scene, we hear that this tradition has slowly been pushed to the wayside, and all that's left
yes.
is this native dance.
Yes,
Um,
yes, that's right. In the film version, we see the dance and everything, and in the book, there's perhaps a little bit more kind of backstory. There's We get a little bit more description of that scene, and so I hope that people will consider it. There's also a kind of wonderful moment that happens in the book, which doesn't happen in the film, where there's a comet that's visible in the sky, and so one of the old guys there on Odo Island says, "Oh yes, when a comet appears, that's a sign that that Godzilla is going to make an appearance." So it's almost like he's like Godzilla's appearance is a kind of divine thing. It's tied literally to what we see in the sky. I think perhaps that was. I'm guessing. I don't know why that was dropped from the film, but I'm guessing that maybe the filmmakers thought that it was a bit hokey or something like that. But yeah, I like that because it really shows how it gives an impression that Godzilla is definitely something divine. He's not just an angry rampaging dinosaur who happened to survive at the bottom of the ocean. Yeah.
and that's something that Kayama did that I think hasn't been replicated.
Mm.
I've talked about this before. I think that the way they portray Godzilla as either this monster of science or this divine being of legend
Uh-huh.
hasn't really been done since then
Mm.
properly.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
I mean, we still get. I mean, Michael Dougherty was all about putting the god into Godzilla. I think he
Mhm.
even said that exact thing.
Uh-huh.
But just that mythic element that
Yeah,
Kayama did is
yeah.
so beautiful.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I really like that scene where they're at the shrine on Odo Island and they're watching the dance, the a kind of traditional Shinto dance called Kagura, which was used to kind of appease and entertain the spirits. So I mean, it makes perfect sense if Godzilla was seen as something kind of divine that these that there would be sort of elements of worship and appeasement that would happen there at the shrine.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean that does seem to be largely gone. I mean, in other films, he's definitely in some films he's he tramples across Japan. Sometimes he's a protector of Japan, but that kind of like religious aspect doesn't seem to be a big part of the subsequent Godzilla stories. By the way, this is like when I went back and I read the original Japanese version of this. I was stunned to find that in the original text, the name Odo Island was not Odo, but Oto, Oto Island. And I the sound D and T are very similar, in
Hmm.
Japanese. And sometimes when people were writing, and writing fast, and especially in older, and sometimes the two dots that would differentiate between a
Hmm.
D and a T sound would get dropped, but they weren't there anywhere in the original text. So like Kayama, in his text he was calling the island Oto Island, which means large door island. So in other words, like Oto Island is the large door through which Godzilla enters the world. That's kind of embedded in the name there, and I was surprised. I was surprised to find out that there was this. I mean, first of all, I'd never seen the characters written down, so it was interesting to realize that was what the name of the island meant. But then I'm not quite sure why exactly, and all this kind of subsequent um, stuff about Godzilla, all the subtitles and stuff like that, it turned into ODO rather than
Hmm.
OTO. Um, anyway, but I decided to go with convention because I thought I would get stacks of angry letters from fans if I reproduced what Kayama had written in the text. But
That's so interesting.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
so cool.
Yeah, and it's so I also went back and I looked at the early manga version that came out before the film, and here too it's Oto Island, not Odo. So like
Huh.
yeah, so in its earliest incarnations, it's just slightly different. But anyway, that's a little nerdy fact that I found particularly surprising.
I love
Some
that.
Yeah, so in the ones that Kayama worked on, like Odo Island, Big Door Island, and Godzilla raids again. The place where Godzilla and Gyrus fight Iwato Island, the Rock Door Island. So like the names of the fictional places that he creates do seem to have meaning. But to return to an earlier point, Odo Island is the location is never exactly clear in the book, but we know that it's somewhere out, kind of away from the Japanese mainland, far out at sea. The characters have to take a ferry to get there, so it seems like it's in probably what maybe some of the Izu Islands, or the kind of project out from the Japanese um, mainland. These are actually very small islands, and they kind of continue for quite a ways out into the Pacific. But those places have been kind of a place of fascination for the Japanese cultural imagination for a long time. Like
Hmm.
there's even hundreds of years ago, there were stories about strange events, coming from and strange things, coming from those islands. The South Pacific was like this kind of like like world to be explored. I think in the Japanese cultural imagination, it's kind of far away, but not too far away that it was like out of sight, entirely out of sight. So it's interesting how like so many things like Matango, Godzilla, even the Ring, the characters in the
Hmm.
Ring
Hmm.
come from those islands, like the Izu Shoto Islands. So like there's a sense of which like in Japanese horror and Japanese cultural production that these kind of distant islands are the places where strange and mysterious things occur.
I love that. And that is what you just said. I want to really establish this, because this is something that, as I've continued to dive into Japanese film and
Mhm.
Japanese culture, I've learned that, have you seen that gif of Charlie Day with like the pinboard behind him, and he's like, it's all connected?
I I know what you mean. Yeah, yeah.
Like, that's how this feels, because,
Okay.
like, in a lot of regards,
Yeah,
like, it does feel like you can link everything. Eventually everything trickles down to the same, like, origin, or just influence. And I think that is such
yeah.
a cool, um
It is interesting. I mean, Japan is a place where people are so they pay so much attention to the arts, to an incredible degree, I think, to literature, to film. And so, our cultural creators are paying attention to what happened a generation before. They're paying attention to all sorts of, artistic forms, books, manga, and things like that, that aren't necessarily the genre in which they themselves might work, but ideas are exchanged with just like an incredible speed in Japan. I think that that's one of the things that makes looking into Japanese literary, cultural, cinematic history so much fun. That ideas are bouncing all over across the place. Yeah.
So, okay. I feel like we have done a pretty good job at starting at Godzilla and going through a beautiful roller coaster.
We've
And
been
we
all
we've
over the place. Yeah.
we've
Even to
kind
the
of come
far
back to it.
islands. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but I have loved this. I've learned stuff.
Oh, great.
Um, what you just talked about, the islands. Um, that just added a whole nother, like, level to what I
Oh,
loved about the Odo Island aspect.
oh,
So
great.
thank you so
Oh,
much.
sure, my pleasure, my pleasure. No, this has been a lot of fun, and you've inspired me to go watch a whole bunch of fun old movies about yokai. I got my work cut out.
So, um, with this, I think we will wrap it up. I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you for
Oh,
the
my
kind
pleasure.
words.
Oh, my
Um,
pleasure. It's been a lot of fun. Yeah, as I said, I've enjoyed your podcast before, so it's great fun to be on it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Before we go, um, I always want to make sure the guest gets to highlight anything and everything they've worked on, anything that they want to
Oh,
promote.
mm,
So,
gosh. Yeah, so I've done a lot of other kinds of translation. Of a lot of the translations that I've done before this Godzilla book here, were were different. I mean, literature that probably people would consider kind of like, like heavy literature. Do you know what I mean?
mhm.
And so I've translated a lot of poetry and a lot of Japanese novels that are sometimes very quirky and interesting. So if you're interested in Japanese poetry, I hope that you'll type in my name and look at some of the other things that I've translated. One of the pieces that I really wish that more people would read is a fantastic, strange, one of the strangest novels I've ever read, published in 1937, and called The Book of the Dead. It's it takes place in 7th century Japan, so in ancient Japan, and one of the strangest things I've ever read. When I read it, I couldn't forget it. I had to translate it. It like stayed with me. But I'd love it if people would take a look at that. And also, yeah, I'm hoping, if all goes well, that the Luminous Fairies in Mothra will be available maybe in the next year or so. As I said, I've already finished the translation, and we're just trying to work out some kinks and the in rights and everything like that. But yeah, the plan is I'm hoping that we can move ahead with that. And then at some point in the future, as I mentioned before, I'd love to do like a book of kind of Godzilla origins, where I collect the radio drama, the manga versions, and some of the other kind of earliest iterations of the Godzilla story, and put them together into one book. That's my own fantasy right now, but something that I'm hoping to work on if we can get the rights. So yeah.
Well, thank you.
My pleasure.
This has been a great conversation. This might be my favorite that I've done so far on the live shows.
Oh, wow, great. Wow, great. I hope that some of your other guests aren't feeling slighted. Nice. Well, thank you.
There is one thing I have to do before I wrap up. For anybody listening, as I've said on my show, I got the privilege to work with Titanic Creations on licensing and getting the character Yongari, the South Korean kaiju, to an action figure form. So that just went live as of yesterday. So if anybody watching they now have payment plans as low as $25, no interest. You can go order it. You can go buy it. If we get to, I believe it's 700 orders, my last and like my most like anticipated suggestion for the action figure was a famous building, a famous gate in South Korea. They decided that they would make that one of the last like stretch goals for the action figure. So if we can get to that point, that'd be great. I'd love to see that make it into this action figure. So go to titanicreations.com/Yongari to order yours if you can. I would really appreciate that. So outside of that, everybody go order Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again on Amazon. It's a great book. It opens up a whole new world to the world of Godzilla and kaiju cinema, something that needs to desperately be expanded upon. And Jeffrey, you started that, so thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and share some of my big G love here.
So thank you, everybody. I know I didn't get to your comments. Thank you so much for being in the chat. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. It's been great. And for anybody who eventually watches this on the video on demand or the podcast audio version, thank you for listening. The last thing I got to say here is please remember, life's too short to not talk big. Bye, guys.